On this episode, we have George Dewar, VY2PLH of Prince Edward Island, talking about activating lighthouses. Also, a discussion with George and Jeremy of the Ham Radio Workbench on the end of Ham Radio 360 Network, and a training item on the use of a trauma medical pack. This is the Field Radio Podcast. I'm your host, John Jacobs, W7DBO. Thank you for clicking and tuning in and joining us on this podcast. If this is your first time listening, thank you for giving it a try. A couple of items to jump into before we get started and bringing on our first guest. I was on the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George and Jeremy last week, discussing the end of the Ham Radio 360 podcast and the trajectory of both of our podcasts. After my interview with George about activating lighthouses, I will replay that portion of the podcast in case you did not hear it. I stuck around for the rest of the podcast and talking building HF antennas. It was a great getting started episode for constructing your own HF antenna for either at your home or in the field. I will link the full show in the show notes if you want to jump over to their podcast and listen to the full episode. Our guest this week is George Dewar, VY2GF of Prince Edward Island. His passion is activating lighthouses and is part of the Maritime Lighthouse Amateur Radio Group. It was a pleasure speaking with George and hearing about Lighthouses on the Air. He gives us some information on how they activate and how you can also get involved. We'd like to welcome to the show George Dewar, VY2GF, Victor Yankee 2 Golf Foxtrot. He is from Prince Edward Island and part of the Maritime Lighthouse Amateur Radio Group. We'd like to welcome you to the show, George.
Well, it's great to be here. And I sure like to take an opportunity to tell people about the exciting world of activating lighthouses, especially from Canada's smallest province, Prince Edward Island, and in 1864, this is where Canada was born, in Charlottetown. There was a meeting there, and they decided to form the Dominion of Canada. And 1867, the Dominion of Canada was formed, but Prince Edward Island, they decided they didn't want to join, so they didn't come on board until about 1873.
Oh, that's interesting. So is that why Prince Edward Island it's the smallest province in Canada? Is that correct?
It's the smallest province. It's about 2,000 square miles.
So when did you first get involved in amateur radio, and how long have you been in this hobby?
Well, I've been interested in quite a number of years. My first direct exposure to it was in the world of car rallies, where in these high-speed events, you have to have communication. So at the time, I was living in Moncton, New Brunswick, and I was the organizer of a national event, and the hams used to come out and provide communications. So 1995, I was employed by the Canadian equivalent of the FAA as a pilot, and I hadn't used all my vacation, and I thought they were going to buy me out. But surprise, surprise, they didn't. And in March, I had to take vacation. So I said, well, I'm going to study for my amateur radio license. So I got licensed in 1995, and I didn't get involved in HF, long-range communications, until about 2012, when I was living in Moncton. So in 2014, I decided to come home here to Prince Edward Island, and I was lucky to get an acre from my brother in the family farm. And if you go on to qrz.com and look up my call sign, you'll see Stately Dewar Manor.
One thing interesting with where you're at in Prince Edward Islands is I'm looking at the list here, and we'll link this into the show notes. You have this has to be a record number of 63 lighthouses.
Well, there are a lot because, this is basically the oldest part of Canada. It was settled first, and strong maritime traditions. So if you go to the other provinces like Nova Scotia and do a Google search, Nova Scotia lighthouses, you'll find an awful lot more than 52. So,
okay.
And there's some very, very famous ones in Nova Scotia. Probably the most famous one in North America is the Sambro Lighthouse at the entrance to the harbor in Halifax.
What you do with you have a Facebook group, which is the Maritime Lighthouse Amateur Radio Group. So you participate in activating lighthouses. Now, we've heard a lot about recently in the past few years activating here in the U.S. with National Parks on the Air, and then also the continuing that's been going on for quite a while is the flora fauna. So why don't you give us a kind of a background on what it takes to activate a lighthouse?
Well, actually, it doesn't take very much. Bernie VE9BGC shows up with the 2 antennas and a radio. I show up with G5RV Junior and a radio. And in about 3 hours, we're set up at the lighthouse. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of these lighthouses have been taken over by community groups and turned into tourist attractions. They're very glad to have us. And we'll take a couple of air mattresses and spend the night there. And just get on the bands when they're active and make calls. I do mostly the sideband, and Bernie does the digital. So it's and there's other people that come and join us. We'll put out the call, and people, if they have the weekend off or they're available, they'll come and they'll take turns operating. So it's really quite simple to do, and the people are glad to have us there. And there's a standing invitation. If you'd like to come to Prince Edward Island and activate a lighthouse, just get in touch with me and I'll make the arrangements for you.
That would be great, because that area where you're at in Canada, I understand is pretty RF quiet and has great openings into Europe.
Oh, yes. It's reputed to be one of the best stations in North America is actually here in PEI. If you look at Victor Yankee 2 Zulu Mike, a gentleman called Jeff, he's got a station on the North Shore of Prince Edward Island. To put it bluntly, is I refer to it as the promised land. Now, Jeff is originally from New York, and he came up here about 17 years ago, built a house, and started putting up antennas. And last year he became a Canadian citizen, and he does a lot of expeditions. In fact, next week there will be one at a place Asia called Spratly Islands. There's a bunch of people set up there, or about to be set up, and they'll be there for a week or so on an expedition. But I'd encourage people to have a look at Victor Yankee 2 Zulu Mike. It's something else.
Yeah, we'll link that in the show notes. So you mentioned you got a couple HFN antenna arrays. How did you work out with you said these lighthouses are now managed by the community for tourism. How are you able to build your relationships with them to get permission to kind of set up these larger antennas?
Well, first of all, they're glad to have you. And, it doesn't hurt that I'm from the area. The total population of Prince Edward Island is about 140,000. And basically everybody knows everybody else. And if you go and introduce yourself, they'll look at you and say, well, who was your father? And it's a very easygoing society, and people's first inclination is to trust other people. And I think it's sort of a creed amongst amateurs that you go someplace, you operate, you leave, and you leave no trace that you were there. So we've activated several different lighthouses here on the island, and needless to say, we can go back to any one of them, and they're glad to have us. And if somebody shows up and introduces themselves, well, by and large, these people will go out of their way to accommodate you.
Now, we mentioned before that you're a local group, but there is a international group, which is the Amateur Radio Lighthouse Society, and we'll link their website in the show notes. But so what kind of events does the international group?
Well, I think they're just a repository for information, and like they have a bot, and like when we activate a lighthouse and we get on the air, I send an email to an individual who's on this bot, and he puts the word out, and you get quite a pileup going. So, but as far as a formal event, the ILLW is, I think, the preeminent event in the world when it comes to lighthouses and lightships.
Okay, and when is that event?
It is the third weekend in August.
What was that called again?
ILLW, I think it's ILLW.org. If you Google it, International Lighthouse Lightship Weekend, it'll bring it up.
So you need to be, for this event, can you be obviously you can be activating from a lighthouse, but is this something where people that are not at lighthouses participate in?
Well, they certainly wouldn't activate anything. They would just basically call in, and it's not a contest. There's no logs or anything, and you go on the air and just start recording contacts, and well, it means a lot if you can contact another lighthouse.
Yes, that's true. Okay, so yeah, we just brought that up, so we'll include that also in the show notes. So this is going to be great. So let's take a minute here, and you kind of talked about what antennas you do, and you kind of say you do some phone and some digital contacts. What kind of equipment are you using for your radio?
Well, I've just got a Kenwood TS2000, and Bernie's got another version of a Kenwood. We just run 100 watts. Bernie has constructed these two vertical antennas, and one does 15 and 20 meters, the other one does 40 meters, and then I've got this G5 RV Junior, which is, well, about 52 feet long, and so if you go on the Facebook page there, you'll see a bunch of typical setups.
I noticed also on the Facebook you have looks like you had an arrow antenna, so it looks like you're doing some satellite contacts.
Yeah, a couple of the people who are associated with us have the antennas for satellites, and they'll come and they'll do some satellite QSOs.
And what do you do you said you run 100 watts. Are you able to pull power from the facility itself, or how do you power the management?
Oh, yeah. They're all got commercial electricity available, and you just plug into the wall, and away you go.
And I notice some of these you're actually inside the lighthouse, so I figured you were setting up outside, but that's kind of nice. You're able to actually operate in the lighthouse.
Oh, yeah. We'll take a couple of air mattresses, and when the tourists are all gone for the day, we'll blow up the air mattresses, go to sleep there. And now there are other lighthouses around that haven't been taken over. They're essentially just standing there by themselves, but somebody that's mobile can just drive up next to them, and you're in business.
Yeah, this is quite fascinating. There's a lot of history, like you said, behind lighthouses, and especially Maritime. So do you do maritime contacts also? Do you get out on boats?
No.
Okay.
No, we haven't done that. It's just basically the lighthouses. And as I said, they're real easy to set up. Prince Edward Island, the highest point in Prince Edward Island is 462.5 feet above sea level. It's rolling terrain, and you can plow all day here and not hit a rock. So it's a very benign terrain, and nothing's hard to get to. And when you get there, the people are glad to see you.
That's good. What's the what kind of times a year would we expect to hear you activating on the air? Are you on? Is it just summer months?
Yeah, basically yes. We'll start in May, And we have gone through till October.
And you operate under the club call sign?
VY2PLH.
Okay.
That's the call sign we use for the activations.
Okay, and so so when you activate, you're on the bot. So anybody else that's kind of following this can follow you on that bot, which is like a spotting network essentially, and listen for that call sign, and you might have the chance to activate Prince Edward Island Lighthouse.
That's right.
Anything else you want to tell us about? Any good rare contacts you were able to make, or any amazing stories where you had a run-in with the weather?
No. The contacts have all been reasonably ordinary. And the lighthouses, well, if I'm telling people about activating lighthouses, I say there's a large number of amateurs around the world go absolutely giddy if they can make contact with a lighthouse. It's a big deal with a lot of people. Some people collect stamps, other people collect lighthouses. You'll see places like Algeria. They'll activate a series of 5 or 6 lighthouses over several weeks. So if you look around on the calendars, there are groups around the world that are activating lighthouses. But Bernie and myself, it's a fairly informal thing. We're friends from Moncton, and it's a 2.5-hour drive for Bernie to get here. And he drives over. He's got a small car. The antennas are all collapsed. In 3 hours, we're up and operating.
There is something special about lighthouses, and so I'm sure when people hear that on the air, do you call CQ? How do you call CQ that people know you're activating lighthouses?
You just say VY2PLH Lighthouse.
Oh, okay.
Now, I have to tell you about a special lighthouse here. It's called Cape Bear. You can Google it, Cape Bear. It is the only Canadian radio station that received a distress message from the Titanic in 1912.
Oh, wow.
There were a bunch of these Marconi stations set up around, and it was one of them. And there was an amateur from Ohio. You can go onto the Facebook page, scroll down there, and get his information. But his thing is going around collecting these Marconi stations. He was over in Newfoundland and operated from one, and then he came here to Prince Edward Island for ILLW. He's a retired surgeon, great fella, Bob. He activated Cape Bear last August while we were down at East Point.
So yeah, there's some history there, and this is going to be fun. We'll link all of this to the to show notes, and so people can be able to listen and look out for lighthouse activations. And then if you're interested in joining some of these, the International Club, I'll put the information there also, and you can follow them and see what you can do in your local area if you have a lighthouse.
Yeah. So as I said, I'm sincere about this. If you think you'd like to come here and activate a lighthouse, don't hesitate to contact me.
Well, I might take you up on that next time I get up to Maine. I'll make sure I have my passport. Keep driving north.
In essence, you don't need a passport to get into Canada, but going the other way, you need your passport.
Many years ago, we were up in Washington and we crossed over into Canada, and my mother lost her driver's license, and she used her a Costco shopping card as ID to come back in the country.
Yeah.
Times have changed, I think, since that happened in the 90s.
Yes, could be.
Well, thank you, George, for coming on the show. We appreciate you sharing some history and some knowledge, and letting people know about Lighthouses on the Air. Okay,
well, as I said, glad to spread the gospel as it is.
Thank you very much. 73.
Okay, see ya. 73.
Thank you once again, George, for coming on the show and giving us a look at activating lighthouses. The show notes are full of links for you to go see his group's operation. Some of the photos are amazing. I recommend checking out their Facebook group and the other clubs around activating lighthouses. He is very serious about being a host to visiting operators. His information is in the show notes at fieldradiopodcast.org. Next, we have the replay of the Ham Radio Workbench discussing the end of Ham Radio 360 Network. After this segment, we will wrap up with a training item.
So before we go any further tonight, there's a topic that we wanted to address with our listeners who have been going along for the Ham Radio 360 journey with us, a lot of you, since the beginning. And we just wanted to take a moment tonight and acknowledge everything that Cale had done for all of us to get us up and running.
Yeah, it's really been quite an adventure. And I know when he started the podcast a few years ago, I didn't even know him. You and I had not met. Actually, none of the three of us met, nor Cale. So it's really been quite a few years. And I got connected up with Cale within about the first dozen or so shows to go on and talk about repeaters. And then one thing led to another, and here we are today. So it's been quite a road. And Cale was awesome in including us in the show and encouraging us to go off and do our own shows, not only our Workbench show, but John, I'm sure that you had quite a bit of conversation with him and encouragement from him to start your own show.
Yeah, I was a fanboy of the Photime podcast. In fact, I was the one that emailed Cale and said, "Don't change the name to Ham Radio 360." And luckily, he didn't listen to me. So I was the fanboy, and then I became a sponsor of the show for a bit, and then I just kind of decided that this is where I kind of wanted to move, and I had no idea. I mean, I'm in video production my whole career, and IT. I had no idea what is involved in producing a podcast. I thought that you just sent your audio to iTunes and it was hosted for free. I had no idea that iTunes was just aggregating some other host. I mean, there is a wealth of information that Cale gave to me to get me launched. I don't think I would have ever been able to launch without some type of support like that.
And of course, at this point, for the most, I mean, just about everybody who was on the 360 feed, if you're hearing this, obviously you have either discovered us brand new or you moved over. At this point, Cale is done producing Ham Radio 360. He's made several changes to hamradio360.com to bring all of the previous 90-some episodes to the forefront, and including, the second episode, which is when Cale had me on as a guest, and then the episode later with George talking about go bags and repeaters, and the episodes with John, and he's basically leaving it out there as a resource, as his gift to the amateur radio community.
So if we fast forward up to, I'd say sort of the September timeframe-ish last year, we got the impression from Cale that he wasn't exactly sure which way he wanted to take the show going forward. And by that time, we had made several Workbench episodes, and John, you had a few under your belt with the Field Radio podcast. And it was really pretty unclear what the future was going to look like. But we knew that Cale was going to take a break, and we knew he was going to come back and do something. We just didn't know exactly what that was going to be. So in a way, it was almost as much of a mystery to us of what the future was going to hold as it was for everybody that was listening. So as it turns out, Cale came on pretty strong in January with 3 shows going out under Ham Radio 360. And then by the end of January, pretty much decided that that's about as far as he wanted to take it at the moment. And he has a lot of other podcast projects that he's working on that are just not ham radio related. And he wanted to go work on that stuff. So I think over the break, he had a lot of opportunity to think about what he really wanted to do and what he wanted to work on next. And so he's got a lot of big plans for other stuff that he's doing. And it happens not to be Ham Radio 360. So, of course, in that process, the three of us were, as we were learning more about what he was thinking, we were pretty much launched in our own trajectory in our own shows. So with him winding down 360, that really didn't affect us that much, except that he was going from a rather constant presence in our lives and in encouraging us to do these shows and collaborating with us to now where he's really focused on other areas, which of course we'll miss him, that he's not more actively working with us on stuff, but I'm sure he's going to be doing things that are exciting and fulfilling for him.
Yeah. So, Cale, if you guys remember, the beginning of our episodes would start with a statement that about the Six Arrows radio network. So Cale is still running the Six Arrows radio network and is in the process of either having launched or getting ready to launch several different shows. And it's exciting because he's bringing on content from other people, but a lot of it does focus around his family. If you want more information and to keep up with Cale, check out 6 Alpha Romeo November, as in 6arn.com. I'll make sure there's a link to that in the show notes, and you'll be able to keep up with him. In the meantime, all of us have gotten a ton of questions within like 10 minutes of Cale's, thanks for everything, Ham Radio 360 out, email, and the people have been wanting to know, are we continuing? John, George, are we continuing? John, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, so I wasn't as tightly integrated with the 360 show like you were, because you were sharing feeds and you were pretty much co-hosts on that show. So I kind of started as the pilot project, I guess you'd say, of bringing on new shows. And so yeah, I appreciate what Cale has done for me. He's navigated the water to podcasting, which I never thought I would be able to understand or get going. And so my thing is I've kind of announced that I will be building in some breaks in the summer and in the around the holiday season, just because it's the availability of guests becoming kind of an issue in those times. And I really want to get out in the field and use my radio. And so I've kind of pivoted a little bit with my show. I announced some changes right around the new year that we're going to go strong. We're going to stay at the every other week release cycle. I did move it to the Tuesday slot where Cale used to be. So it just made sense that I was on the opposing Tuesdays from the Workbench. That seemed to make more sense now that Cale wasn't releasing. And I'm going to go right up through Dayton. I still have Dayton plans, and going to do Dayton, going to do a big field day production. And then right after field day, I plan on getting out in the field and spending a lot of time in the summer, and then coming back strong for a fall season, I guess you would say. So yes, I am sticking around. I've kind of positioned all the shows and everything on its own website now. So it is fieldradiopodcast.org. That used to be just a bounce to the 360 page, but now it's its own website. And my email has changed also. Now it's john@fieldradiopodcast.org.
Outstanding. Now, another thing is that I've noticed here lately, you have been putting a lot of effort into producing really high quality video content.
Yeah, like I said, my life is video production, and so I was doing podcasts because I really like the medium and the format. Like I said, I was a fanboy of what you and George and Cale were doing, and so I really like this idea. And then now I've kind of started pivoting back. I really like doing video production too. So I'm probably putting about 50-50 into doing podcasts and doing video. So I'm almost at the point where I do have a weekly release. I have a video 1 week, and then I'll have the podcast the following week. And then I'm even experimenting with maybe even taking the podcast to video. And then also at the same time, I've gotten feedback where people still appreciate the audio only format. So yeah, this next 6 months is going to be exciting. I'm really excited for the warm weather because it's a lot easier to get out in the field and video when it's not so cold.
Awesome. So George, what are we doing?
Well, I would say we're doing more of the same. So all the work we put into launching the Workbench and figuring out how to structure a show and come up with projects and get guests and all the things that we've been doing, we've been pedaling so fast going down that path that by the time Cale started pulling away, now after the first of the year, we're kind of on our trajectory anyway. So I would say it's really a lot more of the same. So that being continued content every other week with a show that's running on the average about 2 hours. By the way, we did a rather extensive survey, and I'm not going to go through all the details of the survey at the moment, but one of the key questions that we asked the listeners is the show too long? Because we were always concerned that we were going longer than most podcasts, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? And the overwhelming response was to just keep doing what we're doing, and so that was great. So continue with show content, which is generally technical and hands-on in nature. We've got a very good feedback of people that appreciate the technical depth on some topics, but also the introductory level on other topics. So I think that'll be something we want to do going forward, which is to have a good balance between introducing new ideas and topics that are new to the listener and not overwhelming them, and at the same time have enough meat that it's not just, fluff introductory stuff. So I think that balance will be important. Build projects have been a very important part of the podcast. We've had several boards we took to Dayton last year. We'll be taking more to Dayton this year and making those boards otherwise available. So the idea of we're going to design something and take you with us through the design process and share that with you, and then hopefully you can take it and design your own things. So I think that'll be very important. More interesting guests will be important. And some other things that we've got in the hopper. So I would say largely that's the direction we want to go. I think one of the most important things that our listeners could do, this is really we're really asking for your help, is to help us build our following on the podcast downloads. So tell your friends to subscribe, tell your buddies, tell your fellow club members, anybody you think might be interested to our show and to John's show. Please encourage them to subscribe, because if you help us drive the subscription numbers up, then that makes the show more popular. It makes it easier for us to do more things, and just everybody benefits. It's also important to get more followers on Twitter. It's also more important to get more folks engaged on our Facebook page. So those channels really help build the community. And we'll talk about another project shortly to help us do that even more. So I think the one real big ask that we have of our listeners is to be very active and encourage your friends to subscribe on all those channels, the podcasts themselves, Facebook and Twitter at a minimum.
For the training item, I thought I would share some information I came across and incorporating into my gear concerning the need for a trauma pack. I also produced a video on this that you can watch on my YouTube channel. A link to the video is in the show notes. Hello, it's John W7DBO with the training item. A component of operating in the field is the need to be aware and take advanced measures to ensure the safety of yourself and those with you. Normally, emergency services is 5 to 10 minutes away. In the field, they may be up to several hours away. So it is important for us to take extra measures to be prepared for a medical emergency. I would like to share with you a couple items that I carry in my gear at all times. First, a disclaimer. I am not a medical professional, and the information in this training item is what I have researched from credible sources. When I volunteer at events or on the go, I always have with my gear my first responder bag. This bag carries a variety of first aid supplies. A smaller bag that I also carry is my trauma kit. Now, this bag is not for cuts, scrapes, or boo-boos. This bag is meant to stop serious bleeding. After the Battle of Mogadishu, the Army Rangers researched a new approach to trauma medical treatment, with improving what is called the IFAK, or Individual First Aid Kit. This improvement has carried through and made its way not only through the military, but the law enforcement profession and civilians. In 2015, the Department of Homeland Security launched the Stop the Bleed program. This included an info card and 1-hour training to provide civilians with the basic knowledge on how to stop serious bleeding. The Stop the Bleed program has a few simple steps before rendering aid. Call 911. Even though this seems like an obvious step, this is often overlooked when the adrenaline is pumping. First step is to apply firm, steady pressure on the wound. Second, apply a dressing and continue firm, steady pressure. Third, if the bleeding does not stop, apply a tourniquet closer to the torso than the wound. If the bleeding still does not stop, you apply a second tourniquet closer to the torso than the first one. I remember back in Scouts practicing tourniquets on each other. Then the medical community discouraged tourniquets because of the overuse. Now you will see that the idea of applying a tourniquet is once again listed as a medical option for trained first responders, only after direct bandage pressure does not stop the bleeding. So let me go over the items in my trauma pack. This is not as complex as the military IFAKs, but has some simple enough supplies to accomplish the Stop the Bleed instructions. All of the components of this kit are linked at w7dbo.net. First, the outer bag. It is a trauma bag with mole straps that can be added to larger packs or stored on the belt. This bag came with a large pair of trauma scissors. Next item is what's called an Israeli battle dressing. It is a 6-inch compression bandage. Essentially, it is not only a gauze bandage, but it carries a plastic piece that applies direct pressure on the wound. Next item is a pair of tourniquets. These tourniquets are easy to use and has a plastic wand to tighten down the strap and hold it in place. As recommended, I have 2 of them. With that, I carry a Sharpie to write the time when the tourniquet was applied, so when professional medical help does arrive, they know what time the tourniquet was applied. Last item is a series of components from a pre-packaged trauma pack that has gauze, bandage, gloves, and most importantly, a quick clotting sponge. This simple, lightweight trauma pack is the perfect solution for major emergencies, but also essential when engaging in outdoor sports, hiking, and of course, operating your radio in the field. I hope you consider taking a first aid course and being prepared with the right equipment in the field. More information on the Stop the Bleed program and the contents of my trauma kit can be found at w7dbo.net. That's Whiskey 7 Delta Bravo Oscar.net. This is John, W7DBO, with the training item. This will do it for this episode. Thank you for listening, and thank you, George VY2GF, for coming on the show and sharing us your knowledge of Lighthouses on the Air. As always, please send me your comments, feedback, and show ideas to John, that's JOHN, at fieldradiopodcast.org. 73.